Good morning, everyone. Kia ora. So for those of you online, welcome. Just starting slightly late. I'm not David Lont, just I'm a younger, better looking version. David Lont will take over at 9:30. And so it's my real pleasure, right next to him. We're having to share a microphone here, nice and close. It's my pleasure to welcome Martien. He's from UVic, and he's been doing some really interesting work on banks and climate change. And so it really follows on also from Yuli, probably a very different perspective, I imagine, but over to you. So welcome.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, even for inviting me. And also thanks for all the good care and for putting me up in a very nice motel. So thanks for that. Good. So I will talk about the role of banks and central banks in climate change. It's a very hot topic. And I think the first speaker yesterday also alluded to that. There's a lot of action being done by banks. What I will do here is just briefly go on to that or focus on that relationship between banks and central banks. And I will spend some attention to the role of bank capital because that's quite important, but also because before I took the job here in Wellington, I was a policy wonk, I think, at the central bank in Holland. And I arrived there, I started working there in July 2008. And what happened 6 weeks later was Lehman collapsed. It was just after my arrival. So that's association, but not causality. But the thing, yeah. Well, okay, so we visited Cyprus, and then a couple of weeks later, the Cyprus banking sector went into problems. And I also once visited Greece, and then shortly after I left, there was problem with the Greek banking system. And 3 years ago, I was in Chile, and then straight after I left Chile, there were problems with the Chilean economy. So that's why I'm staying in New Zealand. Right, so after Lehman collapsed, I was fortunate that my manager put me into a working group of the Basel Committee and the European Banking Authority and the European Commission to craft the new rules for bank capital, which is now known as Basel III. And so I thought, like, let's, in the preparation of this slide or this talk, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to look at how capital actually can play a role in this environmental or in sustainability issues. And so I thought, like, let's prepare, and Ivan emailed me a couple of months ago, and I thought, like, it must be easy to find some documentation on the role that capital requirements can play in shaping, environment policies and climate policy and so forth. But I was really disappointed because I have an archive of flyers that Mediobanca in Italy sends me every week with about 15 pages of new regulations on banking, and with a focus on bank capital. You can see it's an important topic. There's 15 pages of new regulation per week that comes in discussing this topic. So I trawled through, I think, 250 of these flyers, and I searched for sustainability, capital requirements, environment. And this is all what I really found. The other things were immaterial, and there was not really much. But what it says after last year's COP summit, it says global push on climate risk, but not capital. And that is weird because capital requirements are the most potent or most forceful rules that a bank and bank supervisor can employ to shape a bank policies on whatever type of activities it has. And yet at the COP27, no commitment was made with respect to capital requirements and so forth. And that made me think, like, how can it be that the most powerful tool is not being used for policies on climate change? And so to understand that, I realized there's something going on here, which not always may be aware of in this session. So I'm going to share some of my knowledge that I acquired during my years at the bank supervisor, in particular when it comes to the setting of the standards and regulation that affects us worldwide. I mean, Basel III is the standard adopted now by most countries, but it need not be adopted by all countries, because the Basel rules are only applicable for the Basel members, which are about 30 members. And yet, New Zealand has implemented these rules. And so the Basel rules can be very powerful. And therefore, I think it's worthwhile for you guys to understand how these rules are made. Yeah. So one thing you need to know is about the good, the bad, and the ugly of standard setting in bank supervision. And this, for those who did a banking course, this should be kind of familiar. There's 3 pillars on which the Basel Committee rests or has its regular rules set. And I call them the good, the bad, and the ugly. The first pillar is pillar 1, which is about minimum capital requirements. And that's the most, as I said, the most potent tool and the most important tool to get banks into shape. So what happens if a bank, for example, deems an activity risky or too risky? They assign a heavy risk weight to it, and banks will then move out of that activity. So when it comes to gambling or so, or environmentally unfriendly activities, they could impose a high risk weight to the activity, and the banks then will de-invest and move to activities that have a lower risk weight. On top of that, you have the capital requirements there about what type of capital banks can use to satisfy the BIS ratio or the capital ratio. But this is very powerful stuff, and so there's where most of the action should be, and it's not there. The second pillar is the bad, which is not really bad, but in a way it complements the pillar 1 requirements. The pillar 2 is what they call the supervisory review process, or SREP. The SREP is a process between the bank and the supervisors to deal with risks that are not dealt with under pillar 1. So pillar 1 only focus on credit risk, market risk, and operational risk, which is a very limited set of risks. Pillar 2 and everything that happens in pillar 2 should deal with other risks, like reputational risk or concentration risk or climate risk. And so you would expect that if nothing happens in pillar 1, pillar 2 would take over, or action in pillar 2 will take over. The problem there is that pillar 2 is invisible. So what happens in pillar 2 is between the bank and the supervisor. And in only few cases, you will learn something about what happens there. Yeah. Europe, luckily, is more transparent about pillar 2, and they disclose pillar 2 requirements to an extent for investors, and it's publicly known information. But in Australia, it's very different. If a bank supervisor discloses anything about pillar 2, it's a sackable offense. So you can't say and disclose anything about pillar 2 in Australia. Europe is more relaxed, and in the US, it's kind of hidden under the camel approach, where that's also secret sauce. So there could be action here in pillar 2, but it's less visible. And the third pillar is disclosure, or pillar 3, or market discipline. Now, they are ranked also in terms of a pecking order. Pillar 1 is foremost the most important tool. Pillar 2 is also important, but disclosures is the area where most bank supervisors think like, yeah, well, whatever. And when I worked in the central bank in Holland, most of the junior staff members were allocated to disclosure regulation. So it doesn't have a high status within the bank regulators community. Banks don't like disclosures. Banks want to be opaque, but supervisors don't want to disclose a lot either, because it highlights their own mistakes as well. Particularly when it comes to the Dutch supervisor, under our watch, most Dutch banks failed during the financial crisis. And if you disclose that, then it also becomes clear that the supervisor was at fault. So both regulators and banks don't like disclosures, and it has a low ranking in the pecking order. And yet, if you look at all the action that is taking place in terms of sustainability and ESG, it all relies on disclosures. So disclosures are a bit like the wallflower, and it has gained some relevance now. And I think it's quite important to know that the status of these of disclosure regulations. Okay, one thing that's kind of funny here is that pillar 1 is capital, but capital the source of capital information comes from the accounting. And whenever anything happens to the accounting standards, it will affect profitability in the end, and then profit will be added to equity, and equity will then affect capital. So the accounting standards, IFRS, they are pillar 1 through the back door, or US GAAP. They can have effect as powerful as pillar 1. And so there's always a bit of tension between the Basel Committee and the ISB, because they know that they both have very powerful tools, but the Basel Committee doesn't really like it when the IFRS becomes more important than the Basel Committee. So there's always a bit of tension between these two. At one point, they did collaborate, I think, with the FASB on impairment standards, but that collaboration is now over. And in general, I don't think that the Basel Committee really likes to embrace accounting standards. So there's a bit of a territorial drift there. So that's one thing you need to know. The other thing you need to know, that the Basel member states, or the Basel Committee, it's about 28 members, and the members, they can be very influential on the decision. So some single members can be very powerful, given that decision making in the Basel Committee is made by consensus. So if you have one country that doesn't agree, they have fairly a big influence on how the ultimate decisions are going to be made. So here's an example of just a simple thing where you can see that there must have been made some compromise. If you look at the capital requirements under Basel II, so pre-global financial crisis, you can see that the total requirement was 8% of risk-weighted assets. Yeah. Now, the GFC kicks in, and then Basel III comes out, and what do you see? The total capital requirement is still 8%. Why is that? I mean, if you're a standard setter, knowing that a lack of capital was caused the global financial crisis, and you want to impress the world with some better standards, wouldn't you come up with a different percentage than 8%, which is more or less? So what would be the most likely percentage that the Basel Committee had in mind before they decided on this? What would you say, without going to extortion at high rates, what would be a sensible rate for this one instead of 8%? 10, 12, yeah? But 10 makes sense because you could build it up like, so focus on the 4.5, which is the odd one out. 10 is very simple. You move this one to 2, this one to 2. You have nice round figures. And so you cover this with 6%. Yeah, that was the plan. Why is it 4.5%? So that was ultimately decided in around this time of the year in 2010 between the Basel Committee members. So why is it 4.5%? That's because of Italy. So the Italians, they figured out that if we agree with 6%, the Italian banks would collapse, and you would have a massive crisis in Europe. And this 4.5% is still there because Italy couldn't stomach 6%. Yeah. So everywhere you go into the Basel Committee rules, you will find compromises like that. And so that is how the Basel Committee works. The next one here. Yeah, but that's, so they figured out that the 4% was insufficient. And then as a response to that, they said, well, we need more power in the form of buffers, which then were all gradually built up to make up for this 4%, which is ridiculously low compared to, say, a 4% requirement before the crisis. So the buffer structure, and Europe is very active in that, is there to compensate for actually this very low requirement. So the next one up is the conservation buffer, I think, or the conservation buffer 2.5%. So that moves it up to 7. But the basic one was 4%, and it should have been 6. Yeah. The other one, yeah.
Clarify, like tier 2 had to be 2%, tier 1 6%. Like before they also clarify like that, like Basel 2 doesn't specifically require that, like common equity tier 1 is 4.5, additional tier 1 is 1.
No, well, it's kind of detailed.
The tier 1 couldn't, tier 2 could not be more than
Tier 1.
50%. So you needed at least half of it to be tier 1, right?
Yeah, so that was the only limit. But it's very complicated because banks started gaming that requirement, and that's detailed, so forget that. But it made things very complex under Basel II, so they moved to this structure. The other one is this one here. I won't dwell too long here. This is the definition of equity. So you think like equity, that's shares, but hold on, there's a lot of companies that don't issue shares, and especially in Europe, there's a lot of banks that don't issue shares. These are cooperative banks and mutuals and building societies and savings institutions, and they don't issue shares as we know it. So the Basel Committee thought like, whoever, we don't care because we only do internationally operating banks. And why would we craft rules for some small cooperative in Italy or some small cooperative in Spain? And yet, there's this very lengthy footnote, which costs us about 2 months to craft, that shoes in cooperative capital under, that equalizes cooperative capital as normal capital like shares. And you would have asked, the question here is which 2 countries in particular had an interest in having this footnote in the Basel Committee or in the Basel rules. So the Basel Committee doesn't worry about small banks or regional banks because they are only focused on internationally operating banks. But there's two internationally operating large banks that had an interest in this footnote, which is the one is Rabobank and the other is Crédit Agricole. So these banks started lobbying the Basel Committee because if that footnote wasn't there, then Rabobank and Crédit Agricole would lose their banking license, and then you probably would have another crisis. So these examples show the power of single states in setting the agenda in the Basel Committee, and also what you read in these regulations from Basel. You should be very aware of which country is proposing what type of rules. Yeah. So here's a bit of an idea about the power structure of the Basel Committee. There's about 30 members, 28, and you can see on the map here, it's heavily concentrated in the US. So they have 4 representatives, and then Europe, you know, I'm not kidding you, they have 10 country representatives of the 28 at the table voting on the decisions made by the Basel Committee. So it's very Eurocentric. The problem with Europe is that it's dispersed and they are not on the same page all the time. There's differences between Italy and Spain and the Nordic countries like Sweden and the UK and Holland. And Germany has always been, sorry for the Germans in the audience here, but Germany has always been a very weak player. They tend to pay their way in, and at the latest moment, they can make a decision just on the basis of money. Like, they don't negotiate, but once they want to have their way, they say, well, you know, we're financing entire Europe, so just give us what we want. Yeah. Other countries are members like Belgium shouldn't be there, Luxembourg shouldn't be there. I mean, come on, these are small countries. And in the larger picture, you can see that they should be insignificant. The other thing here is that the EBA, European Banking Authority, and the ECB and the EC, sorry, the ECB is there as member, and the EBA and the European Commission are observers. On the webpage, it says they're observers, but I know these observers, and they're technically very well-skilled people that craft or sometimes shape the decisions made. So these are not neutral players. They are very influential. But what you can see here is that Europe is very dominant in the discussions, but they're also divided. The United States have 4 agencies there. So the FDIC, the OCC, Fed Board, and the Fed New York, and they are united. So whatever they say, it's always the 4 that toe the party line, and it's always coordinated through Washington, which is a pain if you're negotiating in a different time zone, because the Americans will say, yeah, we think it's a great idea, but we have to call Washington first. And so they wait until the next day and they say, well, Washington doesn't like it or does like it, and then you can continue meeting. So that's not very great in terms of the progress of these meetings, but they're very influential because they're always united. Yeah. So in this context, and also knowing that COVID has affected the capital of these banks in a way that many banks are currently rebuilding after COVID, it's no surprise to see that the Basel Committee came out in September with this line here. So, and that's kind of weird, like in this context and with the banks building capital after COVID-19, no surprise to see that there's hardly any use made of bank capital. Yeah? So what the Basel Committee says is, on climate, is there's discuss ongoing work related to measures to address climate-related financial risks. The group of governors and heads of state also came up with this statement just before that meeting of 15 September. The GEOS, they are more or less like a governance body that tells the Basel Committee what to do. And that's the governors and heads of state together meeting. So that's your prime minister together with the governor for many countries, and they meet and they decide more or less what should be done. Now, here's something that's very funny that the GEOS disclosed on the relevance of capital-related risks versus crypto. If you look at crypto, they say, oh no, if you look at climate, they say, we'll take a holistic approach. I mean, wait and see and do nothing. That's my interpretation of that. That's why that's how the regulators interpret that. Let's say a holistic approach and just wait and see. On crypto assets, it's much more interesting here. What they say is very important, and the GEOS, they said, you know, the Basel Committee should finalize such a framework on crypto before the end of the year. So look at the difference in approach, like wait and see, what is immediate action? Yeah. So from that, you can learn that the Basel Committee is divided on climate, whereas it's really clear that they want to deal with crypto. So they have much better rulings already out for cryptocurrencies, whereas for Climate, they're just waiting. Yeah. Which country is behind that? Either Europe, probably not the case. It's the US. They're just sandbagging everything here.
That's because crypto is linked to the central banks.
Yeah. But also, I think it's easier to get data, and also it's more practical to regulate that. So there's more, everybody agrees, probably in the Basel Committee, everybody agrees that crypto is a problem and needs regulation, whereas most people on climate are still divided on what to do. So it's much easier to get consensus on crypto than it is on climate. Yeah, just goes to show the power of such a powerful institution is probably dominated by, in this case on climate, is dominated by the US. Europe is working very hard, and it has a majority of the members there, but they are still divided. So if you look at some of the bank statements made, and I'm aware that I'm a bit short in time.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Half an hour.
Okay, fine.
I'm great, so we can carry on.
So to confirm what's going on here, if you look at individual statements from various central banks made recently, here is the Michael Barr from supervision of the Federal Reserve System recently said this, like, we are also working to understand financial risk related to climate change at the Federal Reserve. Our mandate in this area is important, but narrow. What they say here is, we're not going to do anything here. Yeah. That's how you have to read that. Yeah. And here, the Bank of England outright rules out anything that has to do with capital. It says, we find that regulatory capital is not the right tool, i.e., we're not going to bother. Yeah. It's not that they don't want to, but they don't see it as the right tool. And the right tool would be using it, but that would be problematic because it's so powerful. It's untouchable for now. And then they refer to what the Prudential Regulatory Agency says is that, oh, by the way, climate change, that's just a normal risk, and that should be taken as, in a business as usual approach. So whenever a bank sees any risks that are related to climate, it should be part of their normal risk assessment and feature in capital if needed, but not necessarily so. Yeah. The ECB says in a blog post, they said, yes, the ECB and other banks agree that climate is important, but we're not in the driver's seat here. So they don't want to touch that. And our Reserve Bank here says on their webpage, we're working very hard to study it and understand it. But if you ask the people from the Reserve Bank what actually are doing, they say we're waiting for Basel, i.e., we're waiting for the US, and that may take a while. So it looks like everything is lost. There's nothing to be done. It could be very depressing here, but it's not really the case. Not all is lost. There is hope, and the reason that there is hope is that there's other ways to deal with capital and other ways to deal with climate through bank regulation. So first and foremost is IFRS. They have impairment rules. And one thing that is very important, creating a precedent here, is that Rabobank last August disclosed that their entire agri portfolio has now moved to stage 2 under impairment. So it's on the way to being impaired because most farms in Holland have problems with nitrogen. And the government has decided that farmers should phase themselves out to deal with the nitrogen problems. As a result of that, most farms in Holland are at the risk of not being any longer a going concern company. And so here you have Pillar 1 through the back door. Again, here, very forceful action from one of the largest agri banks in the world that says, we're moving a lot of these exposures to stage 2, which is significant. And it's a very good action being taken. I think here's where the IFRS does action, where the central banks are leaving crumbs on the table. The Basel Committee is also very happy with the ISSB, so doing the hard work for that actually should have been or could have been done by the Basel Committee, but the ISSB has the endorsement of the Basel Committee. Yeah, so this is outsourcing. The other tool you can do is stress testing. We've seen a couple of stress tests. The problem with the stress test is that the amounts of risk identified by the stress test are very low. So, and they're probably underestimated exposures. Nevertheless, they're very small. Like the RBNZ has stress tests where they said if floods rise by, or water levels rise by 50%, only 2.5% of the houses are at risk, which is, I mean, yes, Yeah, and that's knowing the RBNZ. This is an exaggerated figure. They tend to overblow these things a bit, but it's probably minimal. The climate test of the Bank of England, if you go at the numbers, it's about 200 billion pounds at risk. But that looks a lot. But if you compare it to the total asset side of UK banks, 15 trillion, it's a handful of basis points. So these stress tests, they are there to create awareness and to prompt banks into action. But again, here, if you look through the documentation of the Bank of England, this exercise will not be used to change anything with respect to capital. Yeah, so anything but capital, because capital is untouchable. And the ECB, same story here. We expect 70 billion of losses on a total of 25 trillion, which is almost nothing. And then they say, well, actually, this is not a capital exercise either. So you can see that stress tests, they're there. I think they're very helpful in creating awareness, but in terms of real action, it's limited. There's more hope here in Pillar 2 in that the European Union currently is negotiating extremely powerful tools that supervisors can use to discipline banks in this area. And there's my hope is focused on that one, because hopefully the European Union will export these rules to other countries. De facto, the European Commission has become an exporter of regulation, and this is a great tool that is available for supervisor, will be available soon for supervisor. Under the CRD, which is the Capital Requirements Directive, soon supervisors can require institutions to reduce material ESG risks arising from a physical risk and from transition risk in relation to environmental and social and governance factors, so ESG. And what they can do is include restricting and limiting their businesses, so they can actually tell banks what to do and what not to do under this regulation here with respect to ESG. They can change the governance, they can change the risk management, and they can require institutions to review their strategies. This is an extremely powerful tool, and banks do hate this. I mean, they don't like it when the supervisor starts telling them what to do. And yeah. From the CRD, so the Capital Requirements Directive. So if I click on that one here, I can click on CRD and you get that. So this is the one. Yeah. The number that you need to know is 2013-36. That's the if you search on 2013/36, you get the CRD. So that's Article 104 from the CRD. All right, how do I get back here? Oh. No, okay, I gotta go one slide back. Normally it's Alt. Here we are. So that's the CRD. This is currently being discussed within in the European Parliament, so it's not finite yet. But watch that space, because it's going to be very interesting how banks respond to that regulation. Yeah. And the ECB has communicated expectations also. So here the ECB is in the lead here. They're doing a lot of stuff here. They can't regulate. They're a supervisor, so they cannot craft any regulations. So what they did in a recent stress test, and before that for the a couple of years ago, they communicated expectations what banks should do. And a couple of weeks ago, they came out with a thematic review and results from their climate stress test. And they said, we expect banks to, by the end of 24, banks should categorize and know exactly what's going on in terms of the risk that that banks will be exposed to. And then also deal with these risks in a way that it, how to deal with risk management and governance. The complaint then from the ECB is that too many banks are waiting and seeing and doing nothing, but they're really stepping up their efforts here. And then by 24, there's about 12 requirements or expectations that the ECB expects banks to meet. So this is all in a very short time that banks should be moving to under the combined efforts from the European Commission, the European Union, and the European Central Bank. Yeah. One reason is that one thing that you need to know is these expectations, none of them touches capital requirements. And the reason is, there's two reasons for that. The first one is this. This is from my latest paper that I got published. This is about the headroom that banks have to absorb additional capital requirements. So here's all the banks of Europe, the large banks, 100 of them lined up in terms of their capital requirements, which are the bars, and then actual levels of capital that they have. Now, the blue dots are the banks that are very safe. They have much more capital than required. And the two ones here, they're very special Dutch banks that have way high capital, like almost 40% of capital, whereas the requirement is relatively low. But you can see there's a couple of red dots here that are very close to breaching their capital requirements. This makes investors nervous, these red dots.
The one at the very end is
Yeah, but that's Nordea, and they moved their headquarters to Finland because Finland is part of the ECB system, which has lower capital requirements than the Swedish regulator has. And so it's not a breach, but the capital requirements applied to Nordea were the original Swedish ones. And the one that they have is the reported under Finnish rules. So, yeah. But you can see that, these capital requirements are so powerful that banks decide to move to different countries to make sure that they have less worry about. But the red dots are a problem, yeah. And if the ECB starts increasing capital requirements for banks that are recovering from COVID now, you will see a couple of Spanish banks will suffer, for example, from that. So it's a reason why capital requirements are not used, because it may lead to stress amongst investors. Yeah. So this is the capital requirements, not 8%. On top of, it starts here at, what is it, 7.5. The add-on here is what the ECB discloses in terms of Pillar 2 requirements. As I said, Pillar 2 was always the secret sauce, but the European Commission in 2015 decided to disclose that. And I used that for my paper to show, like, the actual requirements are different for banks. And therefore, you can think that the bank is highly capitalized here, but actually it's very close to reaching the threshold. Yeah. That makes investors very nervous. And so therefore, regulators are holding back on using the capital tool, else you get systemic problems. The other thing is investors are increasingly worried that banks are being used to execute policies that governments should be doing. So this guy, Jerome Legras, in the Financial Times yesterday, and if you ask somebody who knows, if you want to know somebody who knows anything about this stuff, like banks, regulation, accounting, and capital, then it's him. And he's a buy-side investor working for a large company called Axiom. And he says, well, actually, we are now getting worried as investors about the government interference into policies and the risk that governments are not stepping in and ask the banks to do their job. Yeah. So there's a risk of using capital as well. Okay, continuing on the ECB and Pillar 2, one thing that I noticed is that the ECB promised to be very careful by using the capital tool. Yet, in the last thematic review disclosure, they disclosed that a couple of very naughty banks that didn't do as expected under the supervision of the ECB got a penalty in Pillar 2. So they say for a small number of institutions, the outcome of these SREP exercises and these stress tests had an impact on their stress scores. These in turn have an impact on their Pillar 2 capital requirements. And so a couple of smaller banks, I guess, they got an additional capital requirement because they were naughty. And here's the example. One bank did not conduct sound and comprehensive material assessments for C&E risk, and its operational plan does not mention any of these actions. So here's a bank that has done nothing with C&E risk. And as a result of that, the ECB got angry and frustrated and says, well, I'm going to slap a capital requirement on top of you. So the ECB is angry, frustrated, and now overstepping their mandate a bit. Yeah. Now, in the interest of time, there's a couple of things that I noticed the ECB is kind of funny or behaving weird. They blame banks to focus very narrowly on floods and heat and the effects of drought. But then they present a picture in the document here, this one, where they say that these countries here in blue, they're exposed to flooding. And me being a Dutchman, I was wondering, why is, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Utrecht, and so why is there a flooding risk there? They have 200 years of, or more, centuries of experience in managing flooding. And yet the ECB identified Holland as being at flooding risk, or being a flooding risk in Holland. Turns out they use satellite data, and according to satellites, the places here are below sea level, and as a result, that's a flooding risk, which is kind of weird. Think about it. So your work together with in the consortium is probably should outbeat them, the ECB, in what they're doing, because you have far more. I think you have far more power there to deal with their forecasts. So their forecasts are kind of funny, and their forecasts are also very much focused on flooding and heat risks. Yeah. So that's kind of tricky what the ECB does. They tend to exaggerate the risks, and they sometimes misclassify risk, I think. It's tricky. So yeah, Bank of England is doing similar stuff. They use a bit of Pillar 2 only for stress test related reasons that lead to potential future risks. So that's, in terms of the pillars, Pillar 1 is not used. Pillar 2 is increasingly being used by a couple of regulators, but most of the action is in Pillar 3. And I'm a bit sorry, I was relying on the German speaker yesterday who would probably discuss these disclosures a bit. But she couldn't attend or do the keynote. But else I would have expanded more on the disclosure part. But there's a lot of work to be done or being done in terms of disclosures. There is, from the European Banking Authority, there is an ESG implementing technical standard, which focuses on, I think, on the green asset ratio and everything related to the taxonomy and whether banks are aligning themselves with the taxonomy. There's many disclosure initiatives from Europe, and they will come into force or will enter into force relatively soon. Yeah. So the first disclosure reference date will be end of this year, which means that banks have to report about 2022 in the next year. All these disclosures that are mentioned on that has to do with the taxonomy and whether banks are yes or no are paying attention to the taxonomy. The green asset ratio, which is, I think, an extremely valuable tool, will kick into force by the end of 24 for the reporting year of 23, which also is a fantastic development. So yes, yeah, exactly. So the green asset ratio counts the number of assets that count as green compared to all the others. Yeah. But there's some difficulty in implementation because there's data shortages and data lacks and so forth. But yeah, the European Commission is pressing very hard to make this work, and the disclosures are extensive. There's also new regulation that has come into place recently. So let me see. This is my last slide, by the way, before I give it a go. So you can see that these are the disclosures that are meant to be implemented in the financial system in Europe. So it's the taxonomy disclosures. Then there is the CSRD, which has entered into force last week or 2 weeks ago, which is extensive on all sorts of non-financial disclosures. Then there is the SFDR, which is disclosures for investment companies and investing products. And then there is the EBA prudential disclosure in Pillar 3 again here. So this is very big, and watch that space if you do research in this area. Yeah, right. So here I think Europe is really taking the lead, and it's very inspirational. It's a bit sad that I couldn't dwell too long on this, but it's a massive area, and if you want to do some research here, please pay attention to what's going on in this space. So to wrap up this discussion, structuring what's happening in capital, there's 3 pillars, or in bank regulation, there's 3 pillars. Pillar 1 is the most potent tool. However, it's not used and it's untouchable. But Andrea from the ECB last week said, I don't think we are still talking about the Pillar 1 requirements at the moment. What he says is, if banks are not moving quickly, we are going to use that powerful tool soon. Yeah? And I know from somebody who works at the Commission that they're already drafting rules in that area to penalize firms for having brown assets, but it's still, untouchable. It will come if banks are not moving quickly. The pillar 2 is more powerful, but it's patchy. There's differences in the way that banks use that, like the ECB uses it to penalize banks, whereas the Bank of England is much more focused on identifying real financial risk. So you can use that, for example, for research to figure out which regulators are doing what in the pillar 2 space. Fascinating area. And there's sufficient variation in the application of pillar 2. Pillar 3 is most popular, but I spoke with a couple of bank regulators, and one of them said, I've been working for 30 years in this area, and disclosures, I'm sorry, you can't talk yourself out of shit you acted yourself into. So still today, the people are, well, that's what I got through the email, and I thought, like, it cannot be other than shit. So she said after 30 years, she still doesn't believe in disclosures. Like, yes, it's there, it's important. I think with the green asset ratio, it will become important. And then you have the IFRS. Yeah. And you have a metric that is valuable. And so there will be discussion of what to put in the numerator and the denominator of the GAR. But yes, watch that space. And you have to be aware that there is a lot of resistance in the banking world against disclosures. They don't trust it. They're not convinced that it's going to work. But I'm not myself very skeptic about it. This is the area where there will be a lot of action. On the so it looks like things are moving towards disclosures. But then I looked at the G20 last week, and they said, and this is also very cryptic. You have to read what the G20 says. They said, we welcome the report by the FSB, this Financial Stability Board, which is, I think, in the same building as the Basel Committee. So they're both located in Basel. And the NGFS, which is also a bank regulator. So they welcome what comes from the bank regulation community on climate scenario analysis by jurisdiction. Yeah. What they didn't mention anything is like IOSCO or ISB. So again, here, it's favoring the bank regulators, but not the traditional disclosure or accounting regulators like IOSCO and the ISB. And so, yes, in the tension between accounting and bank regulation, it's still, the balance is still in the court, or the ball is still in the court of the bank regulators. And the G20 is a bit skeptical about allowing the accounting standard setters to play a role. I know I'm a bit over time, but thanks, this is all I have to say. So I'm happy to share, or you can share the link that I have to this one. All the links are clickable, and you can find the relevant regulation by clicking on the link. So it's a web page, but you know that. So feel free to disclose that. Thank you.
If I could have the microphone.
Yeah.
So, this one's now working, so hang on to that. So other. Oh yeah, it's working. Yeah. So I wonder if there are any questions. So let's look online. It looks like there's a question online. Let's have a look. Fascinating, by the way. I guess we teach. Oh, I don't see it. Hang on. Maybe I see it on my computer. So Quinn does research on banks and climate change. Steph teaches banking with me. I teach banking and do research in this area. So that was really fascinating. So thank you very much, Martien. Let me just see. I thought there was a question online. It seems to have disappeared. Yes, it's disappeared. Oh, it was my own suggestion. Take questions. So any questions from the floor? Yeah. Quick. So everybody.
Actually, when I was thinking about this, I was like on the other side, we are talking about climate change, and we are talking how urgent it is that we need to take action before 2030. And on this side, we have the bank who say that, oh, we are just waiting until then. And they don't even touch like pillar one, but do you think like, yeah, I'm just trying to reconcile between the two thought process. One is that we need to take like urgent action, and the other one is that we just have to wait and see. So like, do you think that bank at the end of the day, they are going to like make any like significant contribution to like, the battle against climate change, or it's just like, they just follow?
I think it's a matter of time. And that's what the first speaker also said. Currently there is wait and see, and central banks are collecting data. There's a couple of countries in the Basel Committee that are pushing back. that may not only be the United States, but it could be other countries that are high in pollution and probably don't have the data. And so they may say, well, let's see before they take action. But if the FSB and NGFS and the collective of regulators plus the GEOS and the G20 started pushing in this direction, then it can be done very quickly. So it's a matter of awareness, patience, grit, and then you will see. And they're threatening. Enria is not a trivial person in the European system. If he says, we're still not talking about pillar one, he means, what he says
We
is
need to be talking about it.
if you don't move, we will make a move in your disadvantage.
Right.
And so they're threatening them. Yeah, I think it's good.
A fascinating talk, and I love in particular that you can translate the language for us, the central bank language, which is really awesome.
Well,
It's funny because there was some proposals, there were sort of green and brown risk weightings that were being talked about at the EU level, but it was very specific. It seemed to be for EU consumer loans. Did that ever come about? So,
I think there's a bit of resistance there because
it never came to fruition.
Yes, but I don't think the experiences with other green factors or they had a small and medium-sized firms uplift factor that
Right.
they would give a discount on risk weights for the SMEs. That
Yeah.
didn't work in practice.
Right.
Plus, the problem that is traditionally the case is if you have brown assets which are totally risk-free,
Right.
why would you penalize them if they're not a risk at all? Whereas on the other hand, green investments can be risky because they're new.
Yeah.
And that's the discussion, but I think it's a disingenuous discussion.
Right. Okay.
Because there's so many rules, especially when it comes to the risk rates, that the bank regulators say, well, you should not be doing activities like this or that, and they just penalize it with a higher risk weight. So if they all agree, like, coal mining is toxic, then they should assign a higher risk weight to it. And
Right.
I don't think there's a problem with that unless there's countries
Well,
moving against it.
I mean, I was actually at a conference in Vietnam, I think it was 2017, and there was a BIS guy there, and I put my hand up and I said, look, climate change is an emerging risk. What about changing risk weightings to reflect it? And he really, I thought he was going to come over and punch me. Okay, he was really pissed off, and then actually he stopped himself and he says, well, if it reflects real risks, then risk weightings are meant to reflect real risks.
Yeah.
And if you look at what's happened to coal firms, a lot of them have gone bust, right? And especially in America with
True.
EPA related risks, right? So yeah, I think they've just been slow on this, but partly because of
But
politics.
also the argument is disingenuous because they assign a zero risk weight to government bonds from the Greek government.
Yeah. Okay. So
they're
not risk weighting properly anyhow, is what you're saying.
They're not doing it anyway.
Right. Yeah.
So
Right.
I think it's a fake argument, and they could push harder on that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay. Really interesting. We
Thank you.
definitely want hold of those slides. So we'll come back in 10 minutes, and David will take over the session. But
Sure.
really fascinating.
Thank you.
Martien, really.